Dear William, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thanks for having me once again. I think the topic for today is the question, what is conservatism? And I'm going to begin by saying I have to change the topic to what is true conservatism? The reason is that all over the Western world, there are various political parties calling themselves conservative, but I don't think in any strict political or historical sense that they really are. Most of them have been merging gradually, slowly shifting to center type parties, not right of center parties anymore. One key illustration of that for me is, for example, the type of socialized medicine that we have in Canada. I submit that no truly conservative party would ever defend that. And yet that system is defended by every party in Canada, including every provincial and national conservative party. No one ever even pretends that they don't want socialized medicine, even though you couldn't find a more socialized program than that. Although I will correct even that, and this is not a lecture on Canada's socialized medical system, but it's kind of interesting because the Canadian system is basically operated by private physicians and individuals and private hospitals for the most part. We have very few public hospitals in Canada. However, access to the medical services is strictly controlled by government, and so is the amount of money that any physician is allowed to charge you for his or her services, which means their entire profession is basically controlled by the government, both in terms of services and in terms of paid access. So I would say it's a socialized medical system, even though to be truly socialized, it would have to be owned and operated by the government, which it isn't. But it has the same consequence with the public. Long waiting times for services and frequent, very silent delisting of official services, and the penalties in the way of fines doled out to physicians who dare to try to charge more for their service, whatever the service is, that happens to be listed by the government as a government-controlled medical service. They get punished. They could even go to jail, although I'm not sure anyone ever has in this country because they don't dare. But it basically means the young fellow who just gets out of medical school can charge you the same for service X as a physician who's been doing it for 50 years, who's not free to charge you more because he's better and has had more experience and so on. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression from our topic of the day, which is about true conservatism versus what I call modern liberalism. And again, that's a phrase we have to think about, because when liberalism got started, it came from the Spanish liberalis and whatever, and from the Latin, I suppose, as did the word conservatism from the Latin. But liberalism had to do with the corner post of a political system that focused on liberty, human liberty, as its most important feature. And modern liberalism, as I have explained in a few of our other lectures, has a lot more to do with forced equality than it does with freedom and liberty. So that's just a little beginning to this talk today, which basically is about the question, what is true conservatism? Well, let me begin, and I'm working again from this book called The Great Divide, Why Liberals and Conservatives Will Never, Ever Agree. It's a sad truth that if they really think of themselves as a modern liberal and a true conservative, they simply cannot agree. And this book is one of the first, I think, ever written in the realm of political publications, which makes it so clear why they can't agree. Now, let me interject further and say that what is this book doing? Well, I've probably given you the example before of the fellow who's standing out in the street on a perfectly wonderful day and looking at all the gorgeous architecture and the buildings in the city, and suddenly they start to crumble and shake and fall down, and bricks flying all over the place and so on. And he says to himself, oh my gosh, it's an earthquake. But really, it's not the earthquake. It's the consequences of the earthquake. The real earthquake is invisible. It's generated by the invisible geological forces far below the ground and maybe 100 miles or more away from where he's actually standing. And the consequence is the rubble that he sees all around him. Well, this book, The Great Divide, and I do encourage you all to go buy it, which sounds very brash of me. I shouldn't be selling so hard. But the reason is I'm so proud of it because it's the first book that I've ever run across, and I dare say I've been through thousands of books in my life, that actually tries to dig at the invisible forces, just like for the earthquake, the forces, the geological forces are invisible, but they're seen in their consequences. Ideological forces are also invisible. They're hardly ever talked about or discussed, not in newspapers, hardly ever in political studies. But in this book, my main ambition was to reveal the invisible underlying ideological forces that tend to drive modern liberals and modern conservatives and set them against each other. So at the end of each chapter, you're going to see a chart that looks like this. And it basically spells out for you on a whole bunch of aspects of political and social and moral life why modern liberals and conservatives are so opposed. And if you read this book, you will find yourself a little surprised, perhaps, by what you discover about yourself. And I often find people who come up to me and they say, oh my gosh, I read your book, The Great Divide. I can't believe how conservative I am. I never realized. And occasionally, it's true, somebody comes up to me and says, I can't believe how liberal I am. I didn't realize I was such a red. And so we laugh about it. But my whole point is that whether you're a red liberal or a blue Tory, which are the colors we use in Canada for these parties, blue conservative, at least now you have a chance to discuss these issues frankly and openly and using the same terminology. So that was the whole purpose for the book. And now let me get started talking about the question of what true conservatism really is. So the conservative philosophy of life I'm going to describe presents a stiff challenge to the worldview of the modern liberal. It is a recipe with specific, tried and true ingredients for the good life, but it is not a speculative theory, for that would defeat conservatism itself, which has always resisted abstract cookbook formulas, ideologies, or paper codes like Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, dictating how we are allowed to live, which is virtually what they do. Rightly considered, conservatism is more like a cluster of recognizable attitudes, assumptions, customs, and traditions. It's a practice or a way of life that serves, and this is key here, not as a precise map for your behavior or rule of life, but rather as a compass, pointing out a general direction. After all, how anyone gets through life always comes down to pursuing whatever they believe is worth doing, getting, fighting for, and conserving, which is the root word that is of interest here. As used in this book, the term conservatism describes an enduring temperament that I am convinced is essential to and will always produce a vital, settled, and deeply rooted community anywhere and anytime. Now, that's a very large claim. But I think that as long as human beings live under tolerable social and political conditions, free of outright oppression, war, or a threat to life and limb, their lives will always tend to be of the conservative sort by whatever name they use. And that is because conservatism, I mean to say, people living their own private lives quietly and striving to conserve what is naturally good, is the kind of life that has been experienced in all flourishing communities in history. And despite the present libertarian socialist tenor and direction of the Western democracies, we can still easily find this sort of conservatism in most rural regions, in small villages and towns, and even in pockets and neighborhoods in even the most liberal of large cities. To this claim, however, and others just as bold may be added, namely, that never in human history has there ever been a permanently successful radical civilization. There have been lots of brief rebellions in history of a kind any of us might have joined in an attempt to correct a local or national grievance. And this gives us a clue. The key distinction is between rebellion and revolution. The former is a protest that aims to restore a cherished social or political practice that has been denied or to repair a useful institution that has been corrupted. But a revolution is very different. It is a protest that aims to destroy a political or moral institution, or even an entire social system, lock, stock, and barrel, and replace it with something wholly new, unseen, and untried. Of course, some revolutions seem well justified, such as the American one. But that event was misnamed, and my American friends, and we have a lot of Americans who live in Canada, they're always surprised when I say this, that it wasn't a revolution, what happened down there. For it was not really, as I say, a revolution at all. It was a war of independence, or a secession, or a rebellion, calling not for new rights, but rather for a restoration of the inherited English rights and freedoms of which the American colonists believed they had been unjustly deprived. The main point is that you may find some conservative rebels, but not a conservative revolutionary, because that is a contradiction in terms. And that is why the great English political writer Michael Oakeshott said that basically conservatism was a rebellion against ideology and politics. And what is ideology and politics? Well, David Hume, whom I'm going to mention soon, and who I think was probably the most important first conservative philosopher in the Western tradition, not counting Aristotle, that is, basically wrote a lot about what he called false philosophy, meaning false political philosophy, in which so-called political philosophers, he really disdained them and disliked them for the most part, were trying to invent systems which they considered autonomous and independent and had some kind of right to rule or subjugate the people to a kind of rule that they had invented, a system they had invented for the perfect society. He was deeply opposed to that, and so am I, and so is any true conservative by his or her nature. Some object to the claim that conservatism is a universal and historically persistent human temperament, because modern political conservatism appeared for the first time with two powerful 18th century thinkers, and I just mentioned David Hume as one, and of course Edmund Burke as the other. And if you dig around in the scholarship, you'll see some really interesting differences between these two men. I've just finished about a 600-page history or biography of the life of David Hume, and it's clear that he and Burke actually met. Their lives overlapped although Burke was older. They overlapped, and Hume was older, and the younger Burke's, when he was in his prime, didn't have much time for Hume because Hume was way too practically minded for him. Burke himself had an almost mystical and theological feeling for the role of the state in human life, and this pops up again and again in everything he wrote. I think he was the more beautiful writer of the two men, but I think in many respects Hume was the more powerful thinker and political theorist. It is true, as previously discussed, that in reaction to Enlightenment rationalism, when I say previously discussed, I mean in the earlier parts of this book, the political label conservatism came into common usage around the time of the Enlightenment with Hume and Burke and so on. Nevertheless, I maintain that the underlying predisposition I call conservatism or true conservatism has been around from time immemorial. Aristotle, to take the most important ancient example, was a philosophical conservative. He called for the priority and conservation of what is self-evidently good in nature. Not theoretically good, by the way, but self-evidently good. In nature, in human nature, in the family, in law, in custom, and in social and political life. And anybody who's read his Politics, which is an amazing and wonderful book, or his Nicomachean Ethics, which is also a wonderful book, will see that what I'm saying is true. His teacher, Plato, on the other hand, was the first thoroughgoing believer in a political dreamland because, unless, as some believe, he was only kidding, and it's true that some modern scholars, when you object to Plato's political theory as laid out in his book called The Republic, that it was basically a revolutionary scheme for the reformation of human life and its replacement by a utopian society. Oh no, he was just kidding. No, I don't think he was kidding at all. He wanted to recreate human society anew as something never before imagined along strictly totalitarian lines. Although Plato was no egalitarian, he felt that, men and women, soldiers and officers of the government and all these people with different roles in life were different, and for many reasons should remain different, especially in his model republic. That book was his paper plan for the perfect society, and a rich tyrant of the period, forget his name, actually asked Plato to implement it for the Greek city of Syracuse. So Plato jumped on a ship and trundled his way over to Syracuse to set up a constitution for the people of Syracuse. But this first attempt at utopian statism failed miserably, as have all subsequent attempts, by the way. So we could say that one of the first and most impressive conservative intellectual rebellions in history was by Aristotle against the revolutionary proposals for human perfection of his teacher Plato. Aristotle was followed by many other influential conservative thinkers in the ancient world, such as Rome's Cicero and Seneca, and a lot of you may be familiar with their amazing writings. And I go to a footnote now, just to say that it galls my leftist friends to learn, they don't like this at all, that all of the great literary figures, I say all, maybe there's a few exceptions, but I think all of the great literary figures in Western history have aligned resolutely with what stood for conservatism in their time. To those I've already mentioned, a partial list, and this one was prepared for me by a professor named Virgil Nemoianou, it's no longer with us, but a wonderful man. They would include Aeschylus and Aristophanes, Virgil and Horace, Dante and Chaucer, Shakespeare, Dryden, Racine and Corneille, Pope, Swift, Johnson, Goethe, Scott, Balzac, Tennyson, Baudelaire, and Dostoevsky. And I stopped there, but these are great figures in literary and really morally philosophical life of the West, and all conservative by nature and in their work. Subsequent examples of a very conservative way of life that thrived for more than 1,000 years were the tightly knit Christian communities of the European Middle Ages, which, contrary to popular belief, were in many ways far more open and free societies than what followed. What? It's true. Women, for example, had lots of voting, local voting, property, and inheritance rights within their own communities, at least. And by the Middle Ages, slavery had vanished almost entirely from Europe, only to reappear and to reach its distressing peak when? In the 18th century Enlightenment, or the so-called Age of Reason. I should also mention the 13th century work of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologia must count as one of the most rational conservative documents of all time, and one that is still a touchstone for the modern resurgence of natural law. And I go to a footnote again to explain the difference between natural law and natural right. This is an important distinction, which we can talk about perhaps some other time, but just a paragraph here. I give a word of caution on the political uses made of natural law, for it is a sword which can cut both ways. It is defended by many conservative thinkers as a bulwark against all arbitrary and progressive governments, especially against totalitarian regimes, and it has been useful to conservative moral philosophers in their long struggle against moral relativism, especially as taught to young students in liberal education establishments. And I'll continue in a moment, but I paused for a little advertisement here. Some years ago, 2008, I think, and I'm recommending it again, I wrote a book which was published by McGill Queen's University in Canada called The Book of Absolutes. It's a defense of, it's a critique of relativism and a defense of universals, which we find in so many fields of human endeavor, and without which we couldn't even undertake those endeavors or those sciences in particular. So any of you who are interested in anthropology, or physics, or linguistics, or any of those fields of thought, you will find yourself fully entertained if you read the Book of Absolutes. Just the title is a rebellion against a world which is saturated with moral relativism. When it came out, there was discourse, so to speak, and hatred all over the place about my book, starting with the title of it. But I was happy to use the title, and I have to say, no one's ever written a refutation of the book so far. So, and people wrote to me and said, "Thank God, somebody finally said it. There are absolutes in this life, you know." And yeah, so that's the release that you'll get if you go into that book. So back to the natural law. On the other hand, there has been what appears to conservatives to be an arbitrary and disappointing use of natural law by courts to achieve the progressive goals of the state, which I call progress from above, meaning the courts rejig the whole society from above. It's not being rejigged or reformed or reshaped by the people themselves from below. And by individuals fighting for their so-called natural rights against traditional moral codes, aiming for what I call progress from below. People will claim they have an absolute right to this or a right to that. And in my latest book, Beyond the Rhetoric, there's an article on, and there's a YouTube lecture which we did together here on the question of rights and the mess that whole term and terminology has gotten into by not clarifying what it's about. This pincer movement, progress from above through the courts, progress from below, and I use the word progress here in an ironic sense, have come together as a kind of pincers movement squeezing, so to speak, and dissolving traditional customs and traditions. And I discussed that in part 2 of this book. Maybe we'll get to some of that down the road. Not today. I should add that there is understandable confusion between the primarily liberal concept of so-called natural rights and the more conservative concept of natural law. So, Leo Strauss, a very fine American political thinker, explained the difference very well in a 1953 book that he wrote called Natural Right and History, highly recommended book, in which he described traditional natural law as an, and I'm using his phrase now, as an objective rule and measure, a binding, that's quote unquote, a binding order prior to and independent of the human will. While the modern misuse of this term mainly describes a series of rights, quote unquote, of subjective claims, in other words, originating in the human will. That's a powerful difference, well explained here, I think, of the difference between natural law and natural right. Conservatism, to continue, famously found a public voice once again in the restoration of the British monarch in 1660 after Cromwell's usurping and bloody dictatorship. It really was bloody, and as mentioned, resolutely conservative in both their intent and structure were the original constitutions of America and Canada. They were dead set against the unchecked will of arbitrary, unrepresentative government, including what they called, and this is an interesting phrase, what they called elective despotism. The only liberty they wanted was what Hume called liberty under law, which for him was the only important kind of liberty. Liberty without law was just chaos and anarchy. They saw more clearly than we that with the ever-present potential of the 51% to legitimize mob rule, listen to this, democracy, and this shocks my democratic-minded friends, democracy has no necessary connection with liberty. What? It's true. It has a connection, of course, but it has no necessary connection with liberty, only an historical one, and only when it's fought for. And a lot of people die to connect it. But there's no necessary connection between the idea of a democracy and the idea of liberty. A democratic system, after all, can be distinctively totalitarian. And a lot of the modern democracies are heading that way. I have arguments with my friends, even like yesterday, one of my cherished intellectual friends said that Canada was becoming a totalitarian state. And I said, no, not yet, although it may be heading in that direction. What do you mean? He says, obviously it's just like a totalitarian state. I said, like what? Well, we said we have pay police, we have feminism police, we have health police, we have all kinds of people walking around monitoring the citizens for this and for that, just like they did in Russia and like they do today in China and all that kind of thing. I said, yeah, but that's not totalitarian yet. And he said, why? I said, because the whole population can stand up and vote them out of power anytime they want. And any system in which you can freely vote the governing party out of power cannot be called totalitarian, but it certainly can be called authoritarian. So what is the difference? Well, it's just what I said. In a totalitarian state, you can't get rid of those sons of bitches. In an authoritarian state, you can. Now, really, that points the finger at the moral tenor of the people, doesn't it? It doesn't point it at the government only. It points it at you and me, so to speak. It points it at the moral tenor of the population and whether they're just too damn lazy to get out of their chairs and go vote them out or not. In other words, people have an enormous appetite for authority, and maybe it has to become totalitarian for them to get angry enough to actually do something about it. And by then it's usually too late. So as I said, it seems a shocking thing to say that democracy has no necessary connection with liberty, but only because we have been subjected to so much hype, equating democracy with freedom. In fact, democracy and liberty have always been independent variables, as shown by the fact, this is just an historical fact, that the English people, most notably, had lots of liberty long before they had any true democracy. And many oppressive tyrants in history, from Nero to Hitler to Egypt's Morsi, have sailed into office just on a tide of popular acclaim. Free people voted them into power. Due to this potential for oppression, the Constitution of Canada and the United States, just to pick two examples, and I think Israel has a lot of these features as well, were set up. In fact, I just finished, by the way, Harry, I just finished reading Netanyahu's memoir called Bibi, My Story is the subtitle. I recommend it. It's an excellent book, whether you like him or not as a politician. He's quite a fellow, and it was quite a story. And, of course, in a memoir, people can polish their own brass all they want. He does a bit of that, of course. Why not? It's his memoir. But I think he also strived to be pretty honest about his failings, mistakes, and all the rest of that kind of thing. But I've always been interested in powerful people, regardless of who they are. And it's fascinating to read stories about their lives and careers and ask yourself how something would have been different if something else had been otherwise. I'll give you just a really interesting example of one event which would have changed history. I was just moving the cursor; it was coming across the screen. I'll give you one example of an event that would have changed the entirety, probably, of Western history if it had been otherwise. During the English Revolution, and you find this out if you read David Hume's wonderful History of England. It's in about six volumes, I believe, and I haven't read them all, but I've read volume 5 and volume 6, a lot of which is about the Stuart regime and about the English Revolution. And in there, he tells us that there was a point during the revolution, before the revolution got started, when Cromwell was one of the key agitators, and he was on a ship moored in the Thames with 3 other English gentlemen who had all decided they wanted to get the hell out of England, and they wanted to, go to America and be colonists and start their lives over. This is Oliver Cromwell. He was ready to leave England to go to America at a certain point in history. And I think that afternoon or that evening, an edict was issued by the king saying that no ships were allowed to leave England until further notice. And so Cromwell got off the ship, and what did he do? He became the key agent in the startup of the English Revolution. And I always think, just that one thing, if one more day had gone by and he had shipped out, the English Revolution and all the things that flowed from it never would have happened. And I think Western history and the history of Western liberty and democracy would have been, radically different from what they actually became. So anyway, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in reading about powerful people. Due to this potential for oppression, at any rate, the constitutions of Canada and the United States were set up to incorporate some democracy only, on the reasoning that life is more peaceful if the laws under which citizens live have the consent of a majority of the people. But they opted for a very restrained type of mixed constitution. And of course, a lot of the thinking for this came out of the French writer Montesquieu in his book about the spirit of the law and all that kind of thing. But this included an element of monarchy in the executive, in Canada at least, but not too much. So worried were they about absolutism of any kind that one American founder branded the powerful new office of the President of of America, this is a wonderful phrase, as the fetus of monarchy. Wow. So the presidential office was the fetus of monarchy, and they were frightened of it. There was to be a role for an aristocracy of merit, similar to the British House of Lords, and we have the same idea in the Senate of Canada, and I'm sure you have a similar thing in your Knesset, I think you call it the Knesset, in Israel, in an appointed upper house or a Senate, which became elective in the U.S. in 1913, but originally it was appointed. In Canada, it's still appointed because there's no trust that the people will be able to put senators in the Senate who are not, political animals. So they get appointed. It doesn't mean they're not political animals. It's become more and more that way over time, but maybe a little less so because, the problem if you have an elective Senate and an elective lower house is you get a conflict of legitimacy in democratic terms between the two houses, and no one really knows who's supposed to have the authority over the laws that are being made. So, the role of which the Senate, that is, as that aforementioned founder, Edmund Randolph, put it, would be, quote, to restrain, this is another interesting phrase, and it's the way they thought in the 18th century, to restrain, if possible, the fury of democracy, quote unquote. No one thinks today of the fury of democracy. It's, it's embraced by everybody, I would say, without much thought. But those folks back then, they thought about it a lot, and they were very anxious about what this fellow called the fury of democracy. And so they wouldn't have any democracy. There's no democratic system in America, and there's none in Canada in the sense of the people making the laws. There's what they called representative democracy. Direct democracy to them was complete anathema because it was just going to set the people up for warring factions, which would never have any peace of mind. So they thought, if we're going to have some democracy, let it be representative democracy, and let us invoke a system of filtration, they called it. By filtration, we'll select the finest people in the land, and we'll send them to Parliament, and they will make the laws under which the people will live. But because we're calling it a democracy, we'll let the people elect them. We'll let the people elect people who are better than themselves to go to Parliament, Congress, whatever, and make the laws. So that was the understanding of how democracy should work, that it ought to have safeguards against the rule of the people. And finally, of course, they wanted a clear separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the courts, so that no one branch would become oppressive, or so that the fetus of monarchy would not grow up and become an actual monarch. Although it's interesting, a former Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson, when someone asked him, what's it like to be the Prime Minister of Canada? You know what he said? He said, it's the closest thing you can get to being a dictator without actually being one. That's what he said, because there was so much liberty for him to make laws and rule and change the laws. So the idea was that the courts should not make the laws any more than a legislature should try a criminal. Now in England, back in the day when Hume was around and before he wrote his history, Parliament often would try criminals. It would suddenly switch from one day to the other to an actual court, and people would be tried in Parliament. Imagine that today. I don't think it could happen. In short, there were to be sufficient built-in checks and balances to block the hated, despised arbitrariness of power. That's the word. That's the word you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about power and modern democratic systems, especially liberalized democratic systems. Arbitrariness of power was the big fear. It was even the big fear in ancient times. If you ask a Roman in Roman times what his biggest fear was, he would say arbitrary power. He didn't want to be a slave. He didn't want to be ruled by another person. So being a slave really was the definition of not having liberty. And beyond that, they didn't think too much about it. My point in speaking of these things is only to say, again, that the original American and Canadian constitutions, at least, and many others which were modeled on them, and many have been, were very conservative because the people who made them were conservative by temperament and from experience. I should add the observation that the history of the mutations of most Western democracies, again, I don't call this progression, I call them mutations of most Western democracies, seems to be a gradual erosion of their original constitutional safeguards, which I have mentioned, against arbitrary government and the centralizing tendencies found in all three branches of government and at all levels of government. We've been watching for the last 100 or 200 years the erosions of these safeguards. So now let me turn to the reason for this talk. What came before was kind of like a prelude, setting the mood and the background. Now I want to talk about the conservative philosophy of life. And I think each of these aspects is important. There may be some that I have missed, but I think all of these are part of it. And the first one could be one of the most important because of the political ramifications of what it says. The first one is summed up in a statement. Human beings are imperfect by nature. That's the most foundational principle of conservative philosophy, the conviction that because all human beings are fallible and imperfect by nature, therefore, no society or government can ever be perfect. So be gone with all your talk about the perfect society. Be gone with all your radicalism and your talk about, perfecting humankind. It's not possible, because if all human beings are truly imperfect in themselves, how could any government ever be perfect? And this is the beginning. It's the lay of the land for all conservative thinking, true conservative thinking anywhere in the world. So that's why conservatives will always say, and I'll get to this shortly, if you're going to design a political system, you have to adapt it to this imperfection of human beings and adapt the laws to that imperfection, not the other way around. You don't want to be making laws trying to perfect human beings who are basically imperfectible. You see the jam that radicals get into when they try to do that, and why radicalism always fails. As I say, for this reason, all utopian schemes for political, social, and moral perfection, attempting to organize human life, according to a theory of progress, are unnatural and fall automatically under suspicion for a conservative. There's an old saying that the best is the enemy of the good. This was a caution to malcontents. It means that if we destroy something that has always worked tolerably well, the good, and attempt to replace it, with something we imagine will be perfect or the best, we will never reach perfection because reality is never perfect. But in the process, we will have destroyed the good. Accordingly, the ordinary conservative tends to accept imperfection. In fact, may love it deeply because his feelings and affections are attached to the here and now. The liberal, in contrast, tends to be a malcontent, rarely happy with things as they are, very happy with things as he thinks they ought to be. This tendency was well described in John Stuart Mill's autobiography, which is also a great read, by the way, about another great man, which is why I read it. Fascinating to hear him talk quite honestly about his own theories and failings, where he said, quote, all the best and the wisest of mankind, among whom he counted himself, that is, among the wisest, quote, are dissatisfied with human life as it is, and their feelings are wholly identified with its radical amendment, unquote. That's a statement drawn out of his own autobiography in which he describes why he was a so-called progressive and was always trying to, perfect human society. His little book on liberty has been a kind of canonical statement about how to go about that. And I think it's been one of the most troublemaking books ever written in the Western tradition, and has caused a great deal of grief for reasons I try to describe in my own work. When I was a young man, mind you, I thought, boy, this is great, all this liberty stuff, fantastic. But people only read the first part of his little book called On Liberty. They don't read the other 4 sections in which he goes back, excuse me for coughing so much. Canada's got this smoke thing going on. We have forest fires all over the place. Eastern Canada and Quebec, Western Canada and Alberta and British Columbia. And the smoke has been drifting all over the country. The sky looked almost pink for the last few days. And all the way down into New York City, if you saw any pictures of New York City, standing across the Hudson River, you could hardly see the skyscrapers. There was so much smoke. And that's got all of us with lung problems. Anyway, what was I saying? So there was a famous Russian commentator on John Stuart Mill who said that John Stuart Mill was a very interesting guy. He said every time he made a declarative statement, it was like a boomerang, and it came back and hit him. And I think that's true. And in the second part of his little book on liberty, he contradicts so much of what he said in the first part. But liberty radicals never read the rest of the book. They just read the first part, and they go off singing about freedom, as if you could be free without law, not realizing that freedom without law is, you better watch out who's shouting freedom if there's nothing controlling what they want and what they want of you. So, second item I want to mention here about the conservative philosophy of life is that concrete experience is preferred to abstract theory. I've been using the phrase philosophy of life to imply a general attitude rather than an ideology or speculative theory, for the conservative is suspicious of speculative reason whenever used in isolation from experience, such as we find in paper charters and declarations that give voice to sweet-sounding but abstract concepts such as the rights of man, or humanitarianism, or natural rights. Some have described these things as a form of legal Protestantism, because just as Protestants believe they have a direct relationship with an indwelling God, human rights too are said to be indwelling by believers. Rather than, as I have pointed out in my own writing and talks here, a right is just a defensible claim. It's not something like your heart or your liver or your kidney. It's living inside you that you can walk out in the street and start shouting about. It's a defensible claim. And if you can't defend it, it really doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. So, as I say, it's been equated, this idea of a right, a natural right, has been equated to legal Protestantism, because just as Protestants believe they have a direct relationship with an indwelling God, human rights too are said to be indwelling. But for the conservative, the problem with all such abstract concepts is that they are never self-interpreting. For example, Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which has been used as a model for a number of European and other countries, is that they function, is not self-interpreting. You need a judge to tell you what the word means. For example, Section 15 of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms is about equality rights, but it says nothing about what equality actually is. So, having claimed the right, you can think it is whatever you want, but it's up to a judge to decide. And if you get a conservative judge on the court, you may be happy with it. If you get a radical leftist judge in the court, you may not, or vice versa. And so that's the situation that Canada and Canada's Parliament is. Parliament no longer issues laws that are considered the supreme law of the land anymore. No, it's how judges interpret the Charter, and they can swing this way or that way. that is considered the supreme law of the land. So control by the people is essentially lost once you go to that kind of system. And most of the democracies have already gone to that kind of system, or they're heading there. So for conservatives, the problem with all such abstract concepts, as I say, is that they are never self-interpreting. They are like empty pots waiting to be filled with meaning, usually meaning invented by politicized judges and interest groups. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen and the Constitution of the former USSR were both replete with glowing promissory terms, and both legitimized state terror. And so the conservative conviction is that it's better to rely on long trusted actual customs, traditions, and practices, and all the documentation that we have in our desks and drawers and offices and homes relating to that, like deeds and wills and divorce settlements and whatever you have that's legalized and actually written down as a concrete right. Better to rely on that and the practices of 1,000 years of human experience than on vague and abstract promissory concepts. Another feature of the conservative way of life is that reason is not sufficient. And just so, there's a long-standing conservative conviction that reason is a means to an end and not an end in itself, that pure reason cannot possibly produce the good life simply because whatever reason, listen to this, whatever reason can create, reason can destroy. So it's a viable use of reason that we face. Nothing was more reasonable than the argumentation of the PhDs and the physicians, highly trained people, who sat around Hitler's table reasoning that it was better to gas various classes of patients and disabled children, and then Jews, intellectuals, dissidents, artists, etc., than to keep feeding them, because the money was needed to buy bullets for soldiers at the front. That was an incredibly reasonable argument that they used to persuade Hitler to do what he did. But in general, the conservative believes that we are not creatures who are very moved by reason or logic, unless using it to defend our own desires or loyalties. Rather, we are predominantly creatures of self-interest, passion, instinct, and emotion, and the restraints on these features of our being must come not only from ourselves, but from socialization via long experience, good habits and manners, customs, and prudence. What is prudence? It's doing the right thing in the right way at the right time. And when someone asked Burke what freedom was all about, as compared to the shouting about freedom from libertarian types, he said, the real meaning of freedom is it's an equality of restraint. It means we have laws to restrain each of us equally from harming each other. And to that extent, we're as free as we want to be, but only within that context. And that equality of restraint must be the same for everybody. So the next feature of...
William? Can I ask a question, please?
Please.
Yeah, you're speaking about reason, that it's not sufficient. So I would like to ask if reason, if it's aligned with morality, if it's going to be measured against the standard of, let's say, the sanctity of life, or anything that protects property and private ownership and all those things. If you apply reason to protect against those measurements of life and property and objective morality, then reason can be a proper method, isn't it?
I think it can be used for the good, but it can also be used for things evil. So my point was simply that it's not reason itself that is the good. I think, as you're suggesting, it's the ends to which it is directed. So if it's directed to the good, then I think it's a useful tool. but I think it's a mistake to believe that reason itself is a good thing. It may be good or evil, and it's been used for evil lots of times, as I pointed out.
So it always has to be compared against a certain standard first.
Yes, you have to ask. When someone walks up to you and says, "I think it's reasonable that your freedom should be limited," you should start asking them what they mean by reasonable. And then you have grounds on which to fight them, not because they said it was reasonable, but because of the grounds they were aiming to get at with their use of reason. It's interesting, and I don't mean to be flippant here at all, but it's a story I put in my book about the young man who turns to his father and he says, "Dad," he says, "I want to make love with Grandma." And his father's just horrified. "Kid," he says, "what are you talking about? What do you mean you want to make love with Grandma?" He said, "Well, it's only reasonable." He said, "You made love with my mother. I want to make love with yours." You see, well, that's a shocking and astonishing thing for anybody to think. But in terms of reason, he was just using a kind of syllogism to prove that what he wanted was good. So the father, quite rightly, threw the whole idea of parallel reasoning out of the window and told him to go do his work or homework or whatever he had to do. So it's a kind of off-the-cuff example of reason being used for bad purposes, which is why the conservative tends not to trust it entirely. He's not saying he wouldn't use it for the good, but he's very suspicious of people facing up to him with quoting reason as the reason why they want to do something. Better examine the motive first. The motive.
So the focus is going to be on restraining the individual equally. That would be the freedom.
That was Burke's idea of freedom, was equality of restraint. If you live in a society in which there's an equality of restraint, and I realize there may be some objections to this rule, but it's a pretty good one, because what he was trying to say, he was trying to stop people like John Wilkes, who was a famous Englishman, who almost brought down the entire English Parliament with his shouting about freedom for everything you could imagine. And it was an interesting story. You can look it up. His name was John Wilkes, Wilkes, and it's a well-known story in English history of a guy who was berating everyone in the name of liberty for almost everything he could imagine. He was kicked out of Parliament 3 times, and the people voted him back in 3 times. Parliament refused to accept his nomination 3 times. The whole thing just went around and round. But I think Burke was basically unhappy with the modern libertarian idea that you can do anything you want as long as you don't harm someone else. Because, of course, that boils down to what you think is a harm, someone else may not think is a harm. Comes down to personal interpretation of harm. So Burke's idea was, well, there are such things as social harm to the entire social body of the people. So let's talk about social freedom as well as individual freedom. It's not just about you. It's not just about individuals. It's about the future. It's about now, what your choices are producing now, in the future, and for posterity of this civilization. Just as the kind of choices our forebears made produced results for us today. It wasn't just something they chose for their satisfaction. They were thinking about future generations. And so Burke's his whole motive was to try to teach us to think more broadly about the meaning of freedom. And that was one of the things he said in response to radical liberty.
But that also requires interpretation and mutual agreement and cooperation by a great number of individuals to be able to answer to that question of how do you take care of the freedom of the individual and the society and the future and all those things that you should take into consideration.
I agree with you, and that's why there's so much emphasis in the conservative tradition on custom and tradition and long-standing habits, and in our system, at least, on common law, on 1,000 or 2,000 years of wise judges making wise decisions in actual case law, not theoretical law like we get from charter judges. Case law judges are making their rulings based on cases that have been handed down sometimes for many centuries and which have proven reliable according to the reason which gave rise to the decisions of the judge at the time. So common law, I think, is a very powerful response to what you just said. So I agree. It's not written in stone, but it is written in the hearts and customs and traditions and laws and beliefs of the people. And that's why conservatives tend to focus on these things as being the greater good, rather than some abstract declarative statement that they dig out of a charter, of which no one knows the real meaning, except some judge who got appointed there by his political friend who wants to radicalize the entire society and can't be stopped. So you could say that the conservative tradition supplies us with concepts of the good, in answer to your question, and protects us from radicalism, because we are able to cite history and tradition in the defense of our judgments, not only with each other and our neighbors over the back fence. By the way, one of my objections to modern times and cell phones and the internet and all the rest of it is that discussions over the back fence have been disappearing. Before all this happened, before even the telephone, people had to get together at the market, in the marketplace, in the street, on the sidewalks, and as I say, over the back fence. And often it was the mothers and the women of society who were doing most of the talking in this way, while the men were out digging ditches and fighting the enemy or whatever they were doing. The women often were setting the moral tenor of the home, standards for raising their children, and sharing their moral habits with each other. This has not exactly disappeared, but it's become insular in the sense of we have internet silos where people who believe this or believe that are only talking with each other and not exposing themselves to contrary opinion, which might in fact cause them to say, I never thought of that. It's true what you just said, because they're not getting to hear as much as we used to what the other person thinks about our behavior or about how we ought to raise our kids and so on.
Very interesting. Actually, it's even worse, because if a mother is staying home taking care of her children and she goes out, at best she will be criticized by all the women who are going to work. She's not going to analyze together or articulate some new contrary opinion. She's just going to be told, what are you doing? This is no way for you to live, and you should send your children to day school, Yeah.
It's the most destructive time of modernity that I can think of, and it's happened only over 50 years. The test case, as I pointed out in one of our talks, for the West was Sweden, which did all its radicalizing, free society radicalization fully intentionally, turned the whole society on its head, and all that kind of thinking and stuff has spread to almost every Western democracy. There's been some pushback. We're getting pockets of pushback, like this whole woke thing. It's just got pushed back in Florida by Governor DeSantis, who's outlawed woke teaching in the schools and this kind of thing. But it's a unqualified disaster. And I think part of the problem began when we took away conversations over the back fence, where people actually got to look at each other in the eye and say, what do you mean? What did you mean by that? And talk it out.
Very important point. Thank you.
So another feature of conservatism is, and I've already discussed this, and maybe we should pass on, but maybe not, the idea that liberty is a qualified good. This shocks my libertarian friend when I say that. What do you mean a qualified good? He thinks it's an absolute. And I said, no, the fact of human imperfection impinges directly upon the question of liberty, for liberty is another double-edged sword. And this is an important statement from Burke again. He warned us, he said, and remember it, memorize it, write it down, whatever. He said, liberty, when men act in bodies or in groups, is power. I repeat, liberty, when men act in bodies, by which he meant in groups, is power. They get together and decide they want to do things to you. So watch out. And that was his emphasis, by the way. He italicized the word power, and not me in this book. This is itself a powerful insight that beyond the establishment and defense of a cluster of natural liberties essential for moral life and a flourishing society, and of course, the ancients all believed that what I just said was true, long before democracy ever became a big feature in their lives. Okay? But beyond that, watch out. When you hear people clamoring for more freedom, be sure to find out what they intend to do with it, or you may end up in their ideological or their real gun sights. The French revolutionists slaughtered their fellow citizens with great passion in the name of liberty, as have all totalitarians since. People get shocked when I say this. What do you mean? Totalitarians are killing in the name of liberty? I said, of course they are. Just do some reading. Read the philosophical background of the French Revolution, and you'll see it all there. The defense of liberty, killing in the name of liberty. Liberty is the most commonly asserted end for which almost any means can be justified. In short, because the liberty of some can easily be used to destroy the liberty of others, beware of the thoughtless praise of liberty, the positive use of which requires much discernment. And if conservatives are about anything, it's about discernment. They also love liberty, but they love qualified liberty, liberty being carefully watched for its misuse, and for the radical proponents of liberty who get out their guns and start aiming them in their direction.
But
so,
William, when they speak in the French Revolution about liberty, there was no liberty. It's just rhetoric. It's propaganda. They are using the term, but they are not living the term. They are not protecting it. There is no essence. It's just an excuse to do whatever they actually did. What is the element of liberty that they actually had?
Well, listen, first of all, I should say, I'm going to answer you, but you make me think more. There's a famous book I recommend to you and your listeners, which you really ought to read. It's called The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy, and it was written by a scholar named Jacob Talmon, Talmon.
I have it. He's a Jew.
Yeah, there you go. In that book, he explains chapter after chapter how violence is perpetrated in the name of liberty. And for Robespierre, that's what it was all about. Revolutionary liberty. We're killing you in the name of liberty because you're standing in the way of ours. That sort of thing. They would go after the aristocrat because he was an aristocrat. And just being an aristocrat was in defiance of human liberty. You must be oppressing somebody. And of course, what we're seeing today with all the woke ideology is the same structure of thinking. There are oppressors and oppressed. In the French Revolution, it was people like aristocrats who were oppressing the poor and the working people and all the rest of it. Today, it's white people and oppressing colored people. It's capitalists oppressing workers. The structure hasn't changed. So when they went after the aristocrats and guillotined them, it was the name of human freedom, which they thought would be brought about by getting rid of the oppressors in the name of liberty. And in fact, there's a famous woman who was one of the huge promoters of liberty. I wish I could remember her name. I'm getting old enough to forget a lot of these details. But when she went to the guillotine, the last thing she said before they took off her head was, and I think I'm correct on this, she said, "O liberty, what evils are committed in thy name?" And then she put her head on the block and they chopped it off. But she got a bit of a surprise, as anybody who's a real promoter of liberty for all would get when they realize that it can be weaponized and turned against those people who are not considered libertarian enough. So they guillotined the aristocrat because he was an aristocrat. But then they went after the baker who sold him bread because he dared to sell bread to an aristocrat. You must have aristocratic sympathies yourself, or else why would you sell him so much bread? To the guillotine, that kind of thing. Like, get out of our way.
Yeah, I think you just demonstrated again that the essence of liberty is the restraining part of it, where you are making sure that the individuals who are seeking to have a liberty and freedom in their life understand the limitations of what they can do.
You said it better than me. And the next section,
I just took it from you.
The next little section on the page, the next point is called restraint is as important as freedom. Burke drives home another conservative insight that the restraints on men, I love this, what he said. He said the restraints on men is what you were saying, Harry. The restraints on men, as well as their liberties, are to be reckoned among their rights. So if you're going to call for rights and declare that you have rights, you should be thinking that the restraints on other people in the name of liberty are among your rights. You understand what I'm saying? So this is how it works. Burke meant that just as our basic practical liberties are inherited as achievements of our civilization, we also inherit the many practical restraints on our liberties, and these serve to protect us from our neighbor's unfettered will or freedom, just as they protect our neighbor from our own unfettered will. It is not contradictory to say that restraint is the guarantor of liberty. So that,
very nice.
That we need to think about. The next point here, you tell me if I'm going on too long because we're not done yet. The next point is that the next conservative point is that institutions, by which they mean important institutions, which have been with us for so long, shape individuals. This is another foundational conservative belief, that all human beings are born unfinished, subject to a multitude of strong and conflicting biological forces, desires, and emotions, and so their flourishing depends to a very great extent on the flourishing of social and moral institutions and not the other way around. Long-lived human institutions are the formative vehicle of our human second nature. It's an important phrase. We have a second nature, which we learn from our families, our churches, etc., from our institutions. The most important institutions are marriage and family, religion, moral customs and manners, core political, legal, social, moral, and economic forms and ideals of behavior, the rule of law, community understandings of right and wrong, bracket, and the duties and obligations that flow naturally from these, close the bracket. Respect for property, the freedoms associated with voluntary exchange and contracts, and much more. Such institutions are produced by the civilizing process over a long period of time, and they finish our human development by providing the standards and boundaries of what Hume called common life. And for Hume, in his philosophy of common life, was far more central, foundational, and important than what he called false philosophy, which is what we get from people like Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill and all kinds of other people who are trying to reshape us in their image, so to speak. No. The philosophy of common life is what we need to be shaped by, because that's what finishes us as human beings. However, as we will see in part 2 of this book, we won't get to that today, but they can easily be rapidly and morally weakened by radical egalitarian regimes that intentionally or unintentionally enter into a competition for citizen loyalty with their own civil societies. And in our last talk, which was taken from The Trouble with Democracy, I discussed that quite a bit, how modern democracies set about attacking their own civil societies. So I won't go into that more today. But the next idea here is the idea of latent functions. Central to the defense of institutions is the conviction that if they have endured, it is because they have latent functions of which we tend to be unaware, but that in large part explain their durability. In other words, in all settled societies, there exists a kind of pre-conscious and pre-rational complex of institutional realities that should be disturbed as little as possible. That's why the conservative says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's just, even though it's imperfect, if it's not broken, just leave it alone. The latent functions at work in all civilizations are the embodied wisdom of their history. I think that's so true and so crucial. And that's why, I think I mentioned this in one of our talks, in Burma, when it was called Burma, I forget what it's called now, Sri Lanka, I think, one of the English colonists, one of the English colonists who ran the country as a colony, he worked in an office, and over the wall behind the desk, because they always had citizens coming in to complain about something or other, over the wall above the administrator's desk, there was a saying, very conservative saying, and it said, "Don't ask, it's just the way we do it." And he got a kick out of it because he said, these distraught locals would always come in to my office, he said, looking very upset. And they would look up above me and they would read the statement. And often as not, they would laugh. And at least half of them would turn around and walk out, figuring it was useless to complain because it's just the way the English did things. In other words, it was a long revered custom. And this guy who walked in to complain was not going to change it. So the next thing I want to talk about as a conservative feature is unintended consequences. The inevitable moral hazard of wholesale change of established institutions will usually be unintended consequences, resulting in a worse situation than what we had. Our foundational institutions are the incarnation of the best that has been said and done by our progenitors, and should be respected and conserved as the embodiment and the gift of their generosity, wisdom, and sacrifice, because they have spent a lot of time and effort getting rid of the weak spots and the wrinkles in the system so that we have what we have today. In this sense, each and every human being is always, quote, in the middle, unquote, benefiting from past generations in the present while observing obligations to future generations who will in turn benefit from us, and so on, as long as civilization endures. The persistent emergence of unintended consequences following radical change should serve as a brake on all hasty social reform. So the conservatives not saying don't change anything at all. Maybe we need to tweak it, but the onus, he would say, is on you to prove that it's going to be better if we do than if we don't, and just put up with what we have. Again, put up with the imperfect system that we have. Maybe better than trying to make it perfect and breaking it entirely. So the next thing I'm going to say, the next item here, is the idea of there should be no change for its own sake. The conservative recognizes that without some means of change, no society can exist for very long. So he is not, as his opponents like to think, opposed to reasonable change where the benefits have been satisfactorily demonstrated. But he is very opposed, root and branch, to radical theoretical change for its own sake. He suspects that words like new, change, and hope are a signal that the political manipulator is on the prowl, looking for more of the people's money to engineer the society of the future according to a personal vision of utopia. So long before any actual change is approved, the conservative insists that the burden of proof that the change will be beneficial is always on the innovator to demonstrate to the rest of us. For a decent civilization is like a spider's web. It's an intricate structure, very difficult to create, easy to destroy. Unless the virtues of a proposal for change can be demonstrated as indubitably superior to what is customarily done, it is better to stay with the true than go with the new. Now we go to something I mentioned earlier, the idea that social freedom is prior to individual freedom. This usually gets a reaction from my more libertarian friends, and I suspect maybe from you, Harry, we'll see. Like the liberal, most conservatives will defend certain qualified individual freedoms to the death, and millions of conservatives have fought to defend them. But unlike the liberal, he will insist on the general priority of what Burke called social freedom. This entails the conviction that individual freedom must be evaluated not according to personal pleasure or satisfaction, but according to its contribution or damage to the common good of society. This is not far, by the way, from the proposal of Immanuel Kant, who argued that in deciding the morality of an action, each of us must behave as if we are moral legislators approving our choice for others similarly situated. Another way to express social freedom is to say that the rights and freedoms of all must generally be prior in importance to individual rights and freedoms, and not the other way around. The conservative is especially wary that in this age of hyper-individualism, individual rights and freedoms are too often used as a battering ram to demolish community rights and freedoms. Traditional marriage is the best example. Individual rights and liberties have been used in Canada and many other countries to demolish the concept of marriage entirely. It's totally gone. In Canada, they use the word marriage, but it doesn't mean anything. They talk about it as a union of any two persons. So, for example, never mind that homosexuals have grabbed this. They love it because there's about 80 laws in Canada which give you financial and benefits and security compared to yourself as an individual that you wouldn't get unless you were married. So they call themselves married and that they're a married couple. But of course, traditional conservatives mock this thing. They call it mock marriage, just like it's mock sex. And if we ever do a session together, which is sure to be explosive on the nature of modern homosexual life, conservatives refer to what they do with each other as mock sex. They say it's not real sex. There's no serious biological scientist, anthropologist, botanist, or anybody else in the entire world who's ever talked about what homosexuals do as sexual, because it has no reproductive capacity. And they only talk about sex in terms of reproductive capacity, whether it's animals or plants or microbes or whatever. So that'll be another discussion. But another way to express social freedom is to say that the rights and freedoms of all must generally be prior in importance to individual rights and freedoms. I'm repeating myself, and not the other way around. The conservatives is especially wary that in this age of hyper-individualism, individual rights and freedoms are used as a battering ram to demolish community rights and freedoms. So the golden rule, so-called, is a conservative institution that has been with us for millennia. But even that rule assumes a prevailing and universal standard of human decency without ever describing what that standard is. So now we go to the concept of custom as the mother of legitimacy. That's a quote. Custom is the mother of legitimacy. It's a quote from the early 19th century French thinker Joseph de Maistre, to the effect that in the very end, it is not abstract propositions on paper that will protect us or proffer the good life, but rather the deepest and most cherished political, social, and moral customs and standards of the people, including in the word custom, all sound habits, manners, and what conservatives like Burke called prejudices, in the original sense that positive prejudices are long accepted social or moral prejudgments that enable human societies to function smoothly. That's what he called a positive prejudice. Today we only use the word in a negative sense, but that's not true in conservative philosophy. For Burke, the 3 P's that guide all established societies are, in fact, prejudice, as I have explained, which is a kind of preconscious knowledge that we absorb from our society that gets us through life without submitting everything that we do to the test of logic. Secondly, what he called prescription, which is the social and moral inheritance of the customs, traditions, and rights of all past generations. And then what he called presumption, or the assumptions that we take for granted because, why? Because all other people do. It's a kind of folk wisdom of the species that serves as our guide. And here we come to another topic of importance to conservatives. The society is an organic and not a contractual reality. For the conservatives, civil society is not an abstraction, as it was, say, for Locke. It's a real, natural, and organic product of historical experience that is prior in existence and importance to individuals. For this reason, the liberal social contract theory, as spelled out by such as, well, most importantly by John Locke, who had such an influence on many Western nations in modernity, the notion that civil society and government are a contractual creation of the people's will must be considered a fantasy, a falsification of history, and illogical to boot, simply because, as Hume argued so well in many of his works, in order for a contract creating civil society to come into existence, an entire structure of civility, law, and custom protecting and especially policing such a contract, in other words, a wholly functioning society, would already have to be in place. I just described for you David Hume's most important argument against contract theory in political philosophy. Even more damaging is this. When asserted as true, contract theory implicitly delegitimizes every government on earth because none of them are founded by contract. And if accepted, even though it's false, contract theory places civil society on a footing of perpetual revolution, subject always to overthrow by the fluctuating passions and popular will of the day, without gratitude or respect for the sacrifices of the past or due care for the generations to come. In other words, contract theory, if it were true, would always make any society anxious because it would be standing on the precipice of its own dissolution on a daily basis. Here's another, perhaps more minor but important conservative concern. The welfare state is an aberration. The conservative faults the welfare state and the comprehensive, what I call the managerial entitlement state that has succeeded it, as a prideful aberration that willfully neglects the proper duty of government to refrain from what? From excessive governing. That's why David Thoreau, when he asked what the best form of government was, he said the best form of government is the least government. For as will be explained in part 2 of this book, welfare states become powerful either intentionally or willy-nilly by entering into a deadly war for control against the authority of their own natural civil societies. I'm repeating that point here. They do this by progressively taking over or substituting their own services for a plethora of traditional forms of social authority and voluntary association by means of legislative bullying and tax plunder. If you don't see that working around you, I don't know where you live, but I sure see it working around me. It's everywhere. Almost everything that around us today that in the past was done by free citizens for themselves by getting together to form things like little soccer clubs and who knows what, now being run by the civil authorities who control these things and hire the staff to manage them. And we pay more taxes every day to let them do that. Another point here, and we're getting near the end, is so important for the conservative is morality and religion. The conservative maintains that the human being is a religious animal and that all humans manifest a craving for the sacred in some way, formal or informal, and that even adamant secularists, in a variety of covert ways, tend to sacralize their own disbelief. For the religious conservative, there is a divine principle in the universe, and God, however inscrutable, must be the author of all things. Less religious conservatives will say that religion is an essential and inexpensive form of crowd control, and that everyday secular morality survives still only because it expresses the moral surplus of a former religious morality. In any case, there's a transcendent natural moral law for the conservative, and we see this in our tradition from Cicero and other writers and thinkers forward, that is somehow written on the hearts of every human being. If it is true that morality sits on religion and philosophy on morality, and all economic and political life unfolds accordingly, then whenever religious belief collapses, the rest will fall in slow motion like dominoes. The conservative will also tend to argue that an atheistic or secular humanist society in which man is worshipped instead of God is eventually doomed, because without any transcendent good as a standard, the only reference point for good or evil is human will in all its relativity, with no higher moral reality or natural law to guide us or constrain us. And then, as Dostoevsky, most nihilistic character Ivan Karamazov warns, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. So now, another topic, and as I say, we're near the end, marriage and the family. The conservative says that all human beings are born of a mother and begotten by a father, no exceptions. And so they share in an eternal family triangle of a mother and a father living with their dependent children. This is the first and most basic of all human societies, and a social entity that survives all states and regimes, and that must be considered the bedrock of all other political and social institutions. It is also the only possible procreative unit, and so the protection and conservation of the family is de facto essential to the protection and conservation of civilization. Heterosexual marriage must therefore be socially and morally privileged over all other human relationships. And I'll get to this if we do a lecture eventually on the homosexual bid to make itself as important to society as heterosexual life.
Maybe next week, if you're willing.
Yeah, nobody can shoot me from there, so sure, let's do it. So heterosexual marriage must therefore be socially and morally privileged over all other human relationships, and all national family policy should be aggressively, I should say, must be aggressively pro-family and pro-child before being pro-adult or pro-individual. The conservative deplores the trend towards autonomism and the atomization of the molecule of civil society, so to speak, and all policies that implicitly or explicitly attack the family as an institution in the name of equality and individual rights are to be deplored. And I think that's what's happened to us all. The family's been dumped as the most important institution, or at least put to the bottom of the pile, as if it didn't matter. Here's another conservative factor of great importance. Difference and inequality are natural. Oh boy, talk about getting shot. You say that in public today, and I say it all the time. The difference and inequality are natural. The conservative believes that with basic freedoms under law in place and defended, there will always naturally emerge a whole range of talented, skilled, and intelligent people and charismatic leaders. And so a kind of aristocracy or hierarchy of authority is natural to all human groups. The resulting social differentiation and distinction of high and even heroic character and moral worth are essential for the modeling of the young. The conservative defends this kind of natural inequality as a vibrant and certain sign of a free and flourishing society. Also defended is the conviction that the strong have an obligation to help, to teach, and to lead the weak, the less gifted, and the vulnerable, and that this responsibility is a permanent obligation of any aristocracy of merit and talent. Getting near the end again.
So inequality is a symptom of freedom.
Yes, absolutely. It's a sign of it.
Mm-hmm.
Natural, yes. What I call natural inequality. And that presumes that equality in the eyes of God and before the law are in place. Everybody likes equality before the law, even though it's not always observed. And everybody likes equality in the eyes of God. And we don't know much about that, but we defend it. But otherwise, inequality should be the rule of all societies that are free, and of human liberty itself, because merit becomes the basis of society, not forced equality, fake equality, as Trump would have called it, I suppose. Poor guy. So inequality is a very strong measure of freedom in society, natural inequality, given that the other equalities
As you prioritize as a conservative the civil society, what are the restrictions that you can put on civil society not to harm the individual?
Well, inequality of police protection, I suppose, things like that, and defense against national enemies, and so on. And I think we have a whole category called commercial protections of individuals. There's all kinds of laws in every country protecting us against the marauding of people in the business community who would gladly cheat us if they could. I'm not saying they're all cheaters, but if you give human beings an opportunity without any prevailing law to rip you off, they're very likely to try it. So these kinds of forms
what about
of law,
the organic restrictions like reputation? If someone in a free society, in a free society, a moral society, if you try to cheat on someone, then you are going to deal with the destruction of your reputation. Nobody is going to engage in business with someone who is acting in fraud.
No, it's huge. And this points, I think, probably you would point with me, this points to the importance of shame in a healthy society. I think shame needs to be brought back. We should stop telling our children in the schools that it's not a good thing to feel ashamed of something. In fact, it is if they've done something wrong. Shame is a powerful social controller and a modifier of human behavior. And I support it entirely for things that are worth shaming and ought to be shamed. And I'm sorry to see that our so-called educators, especially in the public schools, which are out of reach of any religious or moral structures in society, generally speaking. Not all teachers, of course, and I know there are some good public schools and some wonderful teachers, but generally speaking, the public school is a secular, amoral institution where things like shaming are frowned upon as a device for teaching and tutoring and shaping the lives of children, which again, as I say, is too bad. Myself, I came from an era and a time where we got strapped a lot. I was at a boarding school for about 8 years. And the last strapping I got was with a great big strap. This thing, you should have seen it. It was about that thick. I don't know, not half an inch, but 3/8 of an inch thick, at least, made of linoleum or rubber or something. And I got 6 on each hand and 6 on the bum for something that I did. But the big deal was you didn't cry. You didn't whine. You know, you were expected to be a man about it because sometimes your friends were watching this whole procedure. And the most shameful thing that could happen to you would to be a crybaby when you're getting strapped for something that you probably agreed that you deserved. So that's a whole different era. Now, as I say, and I've written about this in my War Against the Family book, we're not strapping the kids anymore. They're strapping us. Okay, it's a metaphor, but they are. And I don't know about where you live, but where I live, and especially in America, but also in Canada, there are lots of schools which have like all-day police walking around the halls, and sometimes with German Shepherd dogs that are sniffing the lockers, the children's lockers for drugs. And in some of the schools, teachers, I don't know if they're mandated by the schools or teachers just buy them and put them on their belts, but they have these little things you can press them and an alarm goes off. When they're being attacked by a student, they press the alarm and everybody comes running to deal with it. So that's why I say that we're not strapping them anymore. God forbid. You would go to court in Canada for strapping a kid now, but they're strapping us in these ways, systemically and literally. We are at the receiving end of the anger of the children. There's something very wrong, and I think it should be changed. So now over to I don't know if I talked about this already. Maybe, yeah, okay, so enterprise and free markets. Like the liberal, the conservative appreciates the importance of free markets under law, the constitutional right to own property, by the way, which we don't have in Canada. There's nothing in our original constitution and nothing in Pierre Trudeau's charter, which was appended to it, which says we have a right to private property. That right is only preserved in common law, not in charter law. And charter law is now the supreme law of Canada. It overrules common law if the two come to clash. And the first thing that most young lawyers are taught to say when they come out of university with their law degree now and they get their first case is, what does the charter say about this? Does it fall under charter law or not?
So if common law is going to be cancelled, it means that you have to say goodbye to your property rights?
We have them in common law, but not in charter law. So if it became an issue before the highest court in Canada, you could not quote Canada's charter, which is the supreme law of Canada, in your defense.
You mean you cannot claim the common law in your defense?
If you were in a common law court, you could, but the Supreme Court of Canada is not a common law court; it's a charter court. Now, that's not the only thing they do, but it's mostly that. Yeah, so a lot of Canadians have said, "Wow, I think we do manage to defend it in lower courts and maybe in the higher court under common law." I'm just saying it's not absolute. It's not an absolute right. So also, let's talk about the flourishing of enterprise, protection against force and fraud, cartels, and all that. And all these related matters are central to the strength and protection of what? Of civil society itself, and the best means for the low to raise themselves high. And there are all kinds of studies, I can quote you on this, which I won't bother with today, which will explain how it is that the best way to raise the low high is to give them property rights, especially to their own homes and their own land and all the rest of it, and a free enterprise environment in which they're protected by these very conservative laws of commerce. And they will rise up by their own hand. You know, they'll buy a lousy pair of shoes and shine them up and polish them and sell them for an extra $1 more, you know, that kind of thing. Or they buy a little plot of land and start to grow their own vegetables. You see their kids in the corner selling beans and peas and lemonade. And it's at the beginning of enterprise for these families. I think I told you I have a friend who's and it was another session, so I'll tell the story again. It's a great story. This kid, I think his name was Billy, like my name. Anyway, he was about 8 years old, and they live on a farm in Tasmania or New Zealand somewhere. And they have chickens. And they had eggs that they couldn't eat. They had too many eggs. So the little boy didn't want to throw them away. So he had Mummy, he said, "Can I take the eggs to the marketplace and sell them?" And his mom said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, can I take the eggs? They're good eggs. Can I take them to the marketplace and just sell them, make a few pennies?" Mother said, "Sure, why not?" So she gave him an egg carton, and he put his name on it. The name was Billy's Eggs. I think I got the name right. Billy's Eggs. He took it down to the local grocery store, and the grocery store guy was very entrepreneurial and loved it. He said, "Sure, Billy, we'll sell your eggs. How much do you want for them?" So Billy made a deal, and they sold all the eggs the first day because they were farm fresh and raised without artificial chemicals and all that. And they just zoomed off the shelf. So the next day he said, "Mom, I sold all my eggs. Can I take more?" So he took 2 dozen and so on. You know, today, this is like 15 years later, that family runs an egg operation. They sell about 30,000 eggs a week to the New Zealand population. So I'm just saying, nice. It's an unbelievable story. And they're still called Billy's Eggs. It's a lot of eggs. There are thousands of chickens running around free range, and they built a huge business out of it because of the kid. But I think that's what happens in poor societies when they have the tools which every conservative would stand behind 100% for creating wealth and free enterprise. There's a wonderful author named Hernando de Soto, D-E, and then Soto, C-O-T-O. He wrote a book called El Otro Sendero in Spanish, which in English, or maybe it's translated into your language, Hebrew, is called The Other Path. And the other path is what I've just outlined. And he maintains that this system, this method, given to any poor society, will create wealth wherever it's tried. So, at the same time, however, the conservative deplores, and I'm on board with this, deplores the over-commercialization and the money vulgarization of everyday life. A key concern is that rampant commercialism, the turning of all things human into financial commodities, may, like the overgrown state, corrode the very social and moral institutions and customs that historically have restrained the worst effects of both. And you can see it everywhere in modern life, especially with the internet and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you can't do anything without getting bombarded with commercials. And I think commercials are important, but they're swamping everything else. If I go to the TV set, say I got 20 channels, suppose, on my TV set. I've actually got about 100. But if I just randomly start clicking through them at any hour of the day, I think I could show you that 90% of those channels, whatever time I start clicking through them fast, will all be on commercials. One or two will actually have a program going and then a commercial, but the chances are almost every one of the others is doing a commercial. And because commercials are so expensive, they're shorter than ever, and they're wham, bang, hit you in the eye, explosive almost, and one after the other. Like what used to be like a 30-second commercial is now 7-second commercials, whatever. Like a machine gun, like a Gatling gun firing at you, So that's why I say the most wonderful button on the television set is the mute button, where you get to be rid of all that, even though you support a commercial society. Finally, I'm getting near the last two items here. The conservative prefers the common law. Whoops, I don't know what happened here. Sorry. Just going to get off of this. Sorry.
No problem.
Sorry. Had a software update in the middle of our lecture. The conservative prefers common law to code law, and we said a lot about this already. There's a distinct and age-old conservative preference for English-derived common law. I say English-derived because other countries do it too, but the English common law started first, I think, among the Western nations. It became the most significant arbiter of justice among human populations before it became widespread in other countries. So there's a distinct and age-old conservative preference for English-derived common law rooted in real concrete human experience and case law precedents that permits us to do whatever we want except what is forbidden by the law. And that's over a code law rooted in abstract legal concepts that permits us to do only what is permitted, decreed, or limited by the code, such as is typical in code law jurisdictions like France and Quebec. Especially disliked in all British-derived systems is the French notion of immunity from criminal prosecution, which they call non-responsibility or inviolability, which is granted to government officials for wrongdoing in the course of duty. In the British or the Westminster system, when it comes to criminal activity, all citizens are equal before the law and prosecutable. And we're seeing that in the U.S. right now, where they're prosecuting a U.S. president, which is unheard of in the entire history of the U.S. And despite how flaky I think some of this is and how it's not even-handed, why aren't they prosecuting Hillary for destroying 33,000 government emails, and why aren't they prosecuting Biden for admitting that he has classified documents in his garage with his beat-up old Corvette and so on? I tell you, the left, regardless of what you think of him, and I happen to think Trump's policies were fantastic for America, even though I could do without a lot of his character foibles. Notwithstanding that, I'd love to have dinner with him just for one night. But he had to be an aggravating, difficult man. But boy, from a policy point of view, a conservative policy point of view, almost everything that Trump introduced was favorable and advantageous to a conservative and a free society. So I hope he doesn't go to jail. And an interesting question these days, over here anyway, is whether he can rule from jail or not. And Alan Dershowitz, who's a wonderful retired Harvard law professor, says that if it happened, he could. Even if he was in jail, he could actually serve as president from jail if they would allow him. Anyway, the last point here is the idea of a strong state, but a limited state. The conservative preference is for a state strong enough to protect citizens against force and fraud, and defend against enemies, and create and protect a framework for the enjoyment of liberty under law, to handle policing and the usual national and international functions of government and so on. But most crucially, and this aspect has been ignored by lots of conservative governments, to safeguard the rule of subsidiarity. Now, what is that? And this is the idea, it's also a Roman Catholic idea, by the way, that all human action and self-governance should be completed at the lowest possible level of government before a higher level of authority is invoked. This means that in true conservative philosophy, if not always in so-called conservative politics, there's a strong resistance to the ever-present encroachment of power and centralization and the push of the state into civil society, like the push downward. The tendency for larger national powers to invade and control the next lower level of government, such as provinces, states, regional authorities, and so on, and for that lower level in turn to invade the next lower level, such as cities, towns, villages, and municipalities. This is only to say that in conservative philosophy, there's a clear moral preference for bottom-up local self-governance over top-down central control. Now I've come to an end, and I just want to say that after this, there come the tables, which outline the difference between liberals and conservatives on all these things that I've been talking about. And I hope if you do happen to think about purchasing this book, you'll enjoy that. And I think, like the guy standing on the street, you will understand much more about the ideological forces that are not only controlling you probably, but are controlling the people with whom you debate. And then publicity again, when you see them falling into the traps, which are clearly outlined in this book, you can say to them, go buy William Gairdner's book, for goodness sake, so you can understand what the hell you're talking about, and we can have a better debate. So anyway, thank you for listening to all this.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and your informative lecture. It was, as usual, very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening.
So next week, Sunday, we will try again, or in 2 weeks? Which one is your preferable?
If you want to do next Sunday, I'm good with it. I'm having a lot of fun. I hope you're enjoying it and not getting sick to death of me. So.
No, I'm enjoying it. I'm learning all the time. And next Sunday, but I think that you should reconsider if you should upload your next video about gay marriage and stuff like that to your YouTube channel, because your channel can be restricted or even worst, you know?
Yeah. Oh, so, you mean they can nuke it? Yeah.
Yeah. we don't want that to happen.
If I upload it after we talk, you mean?
Yeah, because, you know, it's not politically correct to speak about those subjects, and people can complain, and you will get a warning and then restrictions, and you may lose your project.
No, they will. But as a preamble to next week, it will be about the homosexual question. But I look at it from the conservative as well as the liberal position, and I try to outline the arguments for both sides. So if they're going to nuke me, they're going to have to be awfully biased themselves, because I am trying to give the arguments in support of it as well as the arguments against it, and then show in the table the contrast between the two. And I think your people will be interested, because it isn't very often that you see the actual arguments laid out in specific and clear detail the way you're going to hear them next week. Anyway, we'll see you then.
Yeah, I will see you then, and I'm looking forward to that. So have a beautiful day, and I will send you the video link as soon as I have it.
Thank you, and take care, all of you.
Thank you very much. Bye for now.